Hello and welcome to Generation 2020. I hope that you all are having a great time with us. In this session, we will have James Birnie presenting what a great architecture looks like. Hello, James. Everything fine with you? I think you are muted, James.
Unmute.
Okay. So everything fine with you?
Yeah, all good with me. Thank you very much.
Ready to rock this session?
I hope so, yeah.
Okay. So without further delays, I will hand over to you and let's start this session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I have no idea how big the audience is, so it's unlike a normal conference where you can just see in the room. So I just assume that hopefully one or two people turned up. So let's get cracking. What does great architecture look like? So first of all, just a very brief introduction. I'm James. I work for a UK consultancy called Codurance. We're big in the London software craft community, in fact, the worldwide software craft community. I've got experience as a consultant, and before that, I worked for 9 years in a startup, so I've been around a while. Fun fact, I suffer from something called face blindness, but since I can't see anybody's face in this talk, that doesn't really matter too much. Okay. So, architect and architecture. What are we talking about today? So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is architecture. And the reason for that is because I think it's unclear in software what architecture means. Then, as always in these type of talks, I'd like to talk about some antipatterns, some things I've noticed in my travels, which I don't think necessarily work that great. And then the real piece of the talk is what should good architecture look like and what does great architecture look like? So let's start. So this is a cat, and cats, I like to use cats because they're very selfish and they don't necessarily listen to what you're doing, but they always clearly think they know best about things. So the cat pops up from time to time to tell us what she knows best about things, and then she might come back. Okay, so what is architecture? Well, I find that there's lots and lots and lots of different views of what architecture is. Now, a couple of years ago when I was doing a short talk on some aspect of architecture, I went on Wikipedia and I looked up the definition of software architecture. I haven't refreshed this slide for a few months, so there's a good chance it's changed. But what you might notice is if you read those definitions, you're probably still none the wiser as to what software architecture means. I think those definitions are pretty nebulous. They're not very precise. So, you know, I didn't get much out of those. I think we understand what building architecture is. And these two buildings here, I photographed these when I was in Vienna a couple of years ago. I was at a conference in Vienna. And in fact, the building on the right was where the conference was being held. And what I like about these buildings is, to me, they sum up what building architecture is about. No doubt the internals of the buildings require some design from the architect to make sure they function correctly. But also it's very much about what the software looks to the outside world. Sorry, what the building looks like to the outside world. And I think we probably understand that as building architecture much more. And if you look at that building on the right, it looks a little bit like, I don't know how obvious it is over the Zoom, but it looks like there's some really weirdly shaped bridge behavior going on joining those two towers. But actually, if you look much more closely, you'll see that they are just straightforward, straight bridges joining the one tower to the other. And the building is designed so that the reflection of the left-hand tower is making it look like there's an impossible angle engineered between those two things. And I think that's really, really nice. And that's to me what building architecture is all about. It's about giving those type of visual elements to a building. And I think architects have been doing that through the centuries. But what about software architecture? Now, when I worked for ThoughtWorks for a few years, I started to notice that there wasn't really consistent definition of what architecture meant. Everybody had their own opinions. So I started asking various people. I asked many of my colleagues, I asked many of my clients, and here's some of the answers I got. So all the stuff that's important in your system, everything that requires a conversation with another team, that's not a bad shout, because that's kind of talking to wherever the coupling points lie. Shared understanding of the system design, that's a bit less good. Somebody said, well, it's stuff that doesn't change very often. And I kind of, these days, I think I got that answer maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I kind of totally disagree with that now. Bits that link together distributed systems, which is a bit like saying it requires a conversation with another team. Things that need documentation. Yeah, I think we're all scared of that. So then there's one person whose opinion I really respect in software, which is Martin Fowler. He's not the only person. Other opinions are available. But I got this definition straight from a Martin Fowler talk. So what Martin Fowler came up with some years ago now, I think, is if you take the shared understanding of all the different people and the stuff that is hard to change, not stuff that changes less often, but stuff that's hard to change. If you put those two things together, that tells you that those are the things that are important, whatever that stuff is. And that's Martin Fowler's definition. And to me, I find that quite useful, because I would say to a lot of the software teams I've worked with, okay, if someone says we need some architecture, what they kind of generally mean is they want to have a conversation. They're scared of making a decision on their own, or they feel like the situation they're working in compels them to go and have a group discussion. Perhaps they want to share responsibility. Perhaps they just want to do the right thing. But that's particularly why I would often say to these people, okay, tell me, if you make a decision based on that, how hard is it going to be to undo that decision? So if it's going to be really easy to change your mind on that decision, well, why would you need to talk to other people about that? Why would you consider that architecture? On the other hand, if it requires a conversation with other people, if it requires some level of shared understanding, and it's going to be difficult to undo that decision. For example, if someone says, well, we're deciding whether to use RabbitMQ or Kafka, well, I think that's quite a hard decision to go back on after a couple of months. So that would firmly, in my head, be in the architecture space. But if you're deciding on whether to go for a free space or a four space indent in your C# code or your Java code, then clearly that's not that hard to change. So it's not architecture. And somewhere in between, there are slightly more difficult cases than those two. Okay, so what's an architect? Again, I think in the terms of building architecture, we have a decent idea. These pictures here on the right, she's actually dead now, sadly. That's Zaha Hadid. And if you Google for Zaha Hadid, she's designed some absolutely wonderful buildings all over the world. The building in the background there, I think that is the London Aquatic Centre that was built for the 2012 Olympics. She also designed a couple of other buildings in London. And actually that building behind her might be the cultural centre in Baku, which is a spectacular building that she designed. She always liked to do these flowing designs where the roof was never flat, but they didn't have many straight edges. So she's certainly one of my favorite architects. So I think it's fair to say that in terms of the building architect, I think we generally understand what they do. We generally understand what their job is. We generally understand how they do it. So that's clear. So I'm still slightly concerned that we use this same metaphor in software, because as I've said, I don't see that that's obviously it follows. So what type of architects are there in software? So what's a software or a technology architect? Well, again, I think there's lots and lots of different types of job description which have the word architect in them. So here's some examples that I've come across. There are still architects who write code, some more than others, some that don't write code, clearly. Some work very closely with dev teams, development teams, which I think is probably a very useful thing to do. Some that talk about policy. And I think we're sort of going into the area of slightly less useful now. And I think all too often, and sadly, you have architects within a wider organization who have been promoted up past being tech leads and then a sort of team lead or a group lead. And often what they end up doing is they represent the interests of the group, the tribe that they have come from. And one of the side effects, one of the bad side effects of that can be that they actually place far too much importance on that section of the organization. For example, I've worked with architects in the past who, started out as, say, an Oracle developer, then they were an Oracle team lead, And now they're designing architecture, or they're doing architecture, or they're being architects in the time of NoSQL databases and in the time of distributed data stores and cloud solutions. And yet they still think that Oracle databases should be the massive coupling point that everything should work to. And they think it's the single source of truth and so on. And that's a very dangerous position to be in. And then you have this kind of tower of knowledge type architect, somebody that may well know better than everybody else about what to do. Well, maybe that can be good, maybe that can be bad. You can tell what I think of some of these practices. You get architects that over-design stuff. I've worked with architects that try and tell everybody exactly how they should be doing stuff. And to the extent that I say to them from time to time, you know, not being funny, you've spent all this time creating a detailed spec of how you want us to implement something. In the time it took you to do that, you could have actually gone in there and written the code yourself. So I certainly think that is slightly less useful. So, and for all that, there are some very good architects, and hopefully I'm going to talk a bit later about what a good architect is and what a good architecture means. By the way, just a quick disclaimer. In the time I worked for ThoughtWorks, one of the things that ThoughtWorks does, and the same in my later work, is we used to have a saying at ThoughtWorks that if your biggest problem was a technical problem, you probably don't need ThoughtWorks. So a lot of the dysfunction that I've seen comes from that, and I must say that might give me a skewed view of the way that architecture works, because I've had conversations in the pub and with other technologists at conferences where they say, well, you know, architects do this and our architects do that. So I accept that, yeah, all the anti-patterns I talk about are not everywhere. Okay, so talking of anti-patterns, I just want to go through 4 big anti-patterns that I've seen around architects and architecture in my travel. Now, I think, again, I would just like to point out that I don't have anything against architect as a person or as a job description, just the way that it's practiced in many places. So, excuse me. So, architecture anti-patterns. So before I dive into this, I think people overuse the word anti-pattern at times. So just a quick definition. Again, I took this off Wikipedia, but it's more useful than the definition of architecture on Wikipedia. The reason why I think people overuse anti-pattern is that some people say, oh, that's an anti-pattern referring to something. And actually what they mean is it's just a bad idea. But for something to be characterized as an anti-pattern, it has to be a common response to a recurring problem. So it's not just something that some person came up with. I think, you know, I like this definition. It says lots of people are doing this, therefore it's an anti-pattern. So it can't just be Joe having a bad idea or John having a bad idea. Okay, and there are two conditions for an anti-pattern. So the first one, it says it probably looks as if it's a good idea, but it has more bad consequences than good ones. And the second point, and I think this is crucial, is another solution exists that is effectively repeatable and proven to be effective. So I think if we're going to start to characterize things as anti-patterns, we have to understand what problem they're trying to solve, and we have to pick something out as being a better solution to that problem. So on that basis, let's go through what I consider to be the big architecture anti-patterns that I've come across. So here's my cat again. By the way, this is not my cat. I had a picture of my cat, but the designer at Codurance told me that it was crap and it wasn't an HD picture. So he insisted on giving me this better picture of a cat. Okay, so anti-pattern number 1 is the technology police. This is the architect that insists that we need a standard way of doing things. You can't do it that way. Okay, so where does this notion come from? Well, this is the ThoughtWorks Tech Radar. Now, what ThoughtWorks does, and as you might have guessed, I used to work for ThoughtWorks, is it produces every 3 to 6 months the Tech Radar, which is essentially a list of technologies, platforms, languages and frameworks, tools and techniques, and I can't remember the other category. And it says, okay, the ones that are in the middle of the Tech Radar, you should adopt them. The ones that are on the outside, you should perhaps be not using them. And then you've got assess and trial, which means, okay, these are upcoming technologies. Now, the goal of this tech radar is to give people advice on what might solve their problem. But one thing that happens, and I saw this when I was working at ThoughtWorks, and I've seen it since, is that people have picked up this idea of having a list of technologies that are acceptable, and they use this type of metaphor to prescribe to all of their dev teams to say, these are the technologies that you must use. If it's not on this list, you can't use it. And when people start behaving like that, I think it's really destructive. So I asked this question in 2020, or last year in 2019, why do you think you need to standardize on tools? Why do you think that if you've got, say, 5 development teams solving 5 different problems, and perhaps even in 5 different development paradigms, one might be doing a web app, one might be doing a mobile phone app, one might be producing APIs. Why do you think that they need to standardize on tools? Why do you think that you need a single database version there? And I kind of think that this mentality, this standardization mentality, goes back to the time in the 1990s and the early 2000s before we had cloud technologies, where the startup cost for any given technology was massive. Typically, every company would standardize on one big database system. They would have lots of DBAs trained in that system. That system would probably be a massive coupling point for everything. So it made sense to standardize on your database or database tools and various other things, perhaps programming languages and so on. But as the world has moved on and we've moved away from big monolithic applications, it's my firm belief that the right way to approach tools, practices, and techniques is that we should be trusting teams to choose the best tool for the job that they've got at hand. So if you've seen architecture that involves architects prescribing technologies and saying, you can't use that, we don't have expertise, I think that's an anti-pattern. In fact, I'll give you an example. I think it was only last year on a job I was working on where we were designing a tiny little microservice to do one thing, which was going to be rolled out into the whole ecosystem of existing microservices. We wanted a single key value store to back this service. And naturally, we wanted to choose something in Amazon that was hosted. And we were told, oh, you can't use, I think it was, they said you can't use DynamoDB and you can't use RDS with Postgres. You have to use MySQL because we've only got MySQL DBAs. But what escaped their attention was we were saying, yeah, but your DBAs are never going to be aware of this. It's a tiny data store that's only going to do one thing. And these people were saying to us, yeah, but what about if the indexes go wrong? What about? And I was like, yeah, but you've clearly missed the point about how the world's moved on. Amazon RDS is going to handle all that stuff. The whole point of something like RDS is abstracting away the problems such as indexing, such as how to design your data stores. It's abstracting it away from the developers. So that's the first anti-pattern. And as I say, what's the proven repeatable solution? Well, choose the best tool for the job. So secondly, and this is an anti-pattern that I've seen to be very destructive, the framework designer. You sometimes find architects that think that the right way to go to develop everything is to create a framework. And to be honest, I did this myself in the early 2000s in a company I was working for. I thought I knew better than other developers, and I invested a lot of time in writing what I thought was a good framework that could be used as the building blocks for all of the applications that we needed to build against our ecosystem. So how does that normally play out? Well, what normally ends up happening is that this framework gets built and it doesn't do what everybody wants it to do. It probably solves quite well the problem that I was trying to solve, that I was most closely associated with, but it won't solve everybody else's problems. And it misses the point. And I see, as I say, I was an inexperienced developer at the time. I think effectively I rewrote something like Microsoft MVC. And I've seen people do things where they write a messaging framework on top of RabbitMQ, because they're saying, well, yeah, but if you use this framework, you'll be using it right. You'll be doing the messaging consistently. And it kind of misses the point that the developers, again, ought to be capable of understanding how to use RabbitMQ. It's like if you're writing a framework on top of a framework, you should be asking yourself some questions here. So what problem are we trying to solve? I think that the problem that is attempting to being solved here is actually a problem of lack of trust for your development teams. I think I've seen it used where there's an onshore development team that is being forced to work with an offshore team, They write a framework which the offshore team then has to use, and they think it's going to solve this problem of them not being good enough in their eyes to do stuff. But actually, as I say, the problem is a lack of trust, and it doesn't address the problem of the lack of trust. So I think it's much better to take the view that you should be an advisor, not a dictator. And the real solution should be to provide libraries that your teams might choose to use, but still allow them to choose the right tools for the job. And here's how this one sometimes plays out. And I think I've seen this happen. Somebody gets something wrong. Some team, it might be a team in the Far East that you're working with. Something goes wrong in the release, whether it was their fault or not, it doesn't matter. But they probably get the blame. So someone says, well, if we make a framework, we'll make sure this can't happen again. So they make the framework, but of course it doesn't work for all cases. And these architects that are making the framework are screaming at the developers saying, you need to use this framework, you need to use this framework. Well, that means that these developers can't get stuff done because it's hard for them to use this framework, which of course leads to more bad releases and a bigger feeling that we don't trust our developers. So you need to break that cycle. The only way to break that cycle is to actually trust people, is to find ways to trust each other, to collaborate better. Excuse me. So I think I've probably already covered this a bit. Why do architects build highly opinionated frameworks? I do wonder, actually, there is a good point there, whether these architects are trying to find ways to stay in touch and still write code. I think there might be a hierarchy that they're trying to assert. There's definitely going to be a lack of trust, which I think is the main cause of this. And there's usually some history of things going wrong in the past. What's the problem that's trying to be solved? Well, I think you need to take a step back and ask what problem it's trying to solve. And often in software in general, if it's hard to articulate what the problem was to which this thing was a proposed solution, it is probably a bad idea to have built it. So, yeah, is there a desire for cost control, lack of trust and empathy? So that's the real problem. Is there even a problem to be solved? Possibly, possibly not. But trust and empathy is certainly something that I would encourage those types of architects to move on from. Building capable cross-functional teams would be a good start instead of having second-class teams that are lying around in different all parts of the organization. Making sure they can own their whole value stream is also going to help. Okay. Third anti-pattern I see a lot of is the librarian. This is the person that is insisting on everything being documented. Even though documentation is out of date the moment that I finish writing it, they insist that you haven't finished your job until stuff gets documented. Now, I agree that sometimes there are regulatory frameworks that impose this, and unfortunately we all have to work with those, but sometimes architects go over the top on this. Again, I'd like to ask, what problem are we trying to solve? Well, nobody can work out how to do stuff. There might be regulatory guidelines. I'm concerned that documentation is often the first part of risk management theatre, which I'll come on to. And unfortunately, extra documentation can also mean a hell of a lot of upfront documentation and design, which I think we all accept isn't the right way to go in the modern world. And I do wonder if documentation can form a surrogate for communication. I think if people, what I hate about some organizations is if you say, well, how does this work? And they say, look in the documentation. And I'm like, no, I want a conversation about this. So I do wonder if sometimes people use documentation as a surrogate for a real conversation. So again, I urge people to always ask, what's the problem to which this is the proposed solution? And, you know, is the perceived need for documentation a failure of communication? If so, communicate better. I just want a quick word here about risk management theatre. And architecture, bad practices can follow on from this. We see this a lot as consultants. It's processes that have been detached from the original intent. If people find themselves servicing checklists as part of their daily work without really understanding what outcomes they're looking for, that's risk management theatre. It's when processes are the most important thing rather than outcomes. I'm going to give you an example of this. This is a photograph taken actually just down the road from where I'm sitting now in my flat. You can just about see this here. I was walking into the town centre with my daughters about a year ago, and I saw this sign here, caution broken glass. And if you look at this photo, you'll see that there is at least 4 pieces of fencing that have been erected. They're actually secured to those railings, and someone's gone to a lot of effort to make sure you don't tread on this broken glass. But the broken glass, it is there. I'll zoom in for it. You can see it just there, or perhaps you can't yet see it. So let's zoom in. There's the broken glass. So you can see how much danger that was being caused to the people walking past. And the reason why this is risk management theatre is because somebody at some point, I would guess, cut themselves on some broken glass in the area of this building. Somebody else created a procedure which said, step one, secure the area. So then this person went to all this expense to put these fences up to make sure nobody trod in this glass. These fences stayed there for at least 3 weeks. When really, when you look at the amount of broken glass that was there, why didn't that person, instead of going to all that effort and expense, just clear it up? And this is my point about risk management theatre. It takes away the option for people to use their common sense. And this is the logical extension to practices such as an insistence on documentation. Okay, my final anti-pattern. And if you've worked with people whose role is described as an enterprise architect, you may well have come across this yourself. This is Architectology. Now, I've seen this in lots of older organizations. It's usually when there's some legacy in play and lots of silos. And the Architectologist is someone whose role it is, it's a combination of architecture and archaeology. You put the two together, you get Architectology. And this is the person who will tell you, okay, if you want to add value in this way, this is how you do it. You have to go and talk to this team, then you have to talk to this team, then you have to talk to this team, and so on and so on and so on, and that's how you do it. Instead of telling you and having a sensible conversation about how we might add the value, you're told how to add the value. And it usually involves traversing a lot of silos. It's usually very painful. And if you find these things, these are the sort of common traits of it. So if your job title has got architect in it, yeah, okay. Normally at this point, if I was with an audience, I'd ask people to put their hand up if any of these things apply to them. If you very rarely or you never write code, if you've worked on a lot of different systems in your company and you still do talk to a lot of those people in your company, and you certainly talk to a lot of tech leads about what their system does. If you do a lot of diagrams, if you find yourself drawing many, many diagrams with this title, current state, then you also find yourself drawing a lot of diagrams with the title, future state, but you don't have confidence you'll ever get to that future state. If you find yourself saying, this is how we do this a lot, and you go to a lot of committee meetings, and you negotiate between teams a lot, if you find yourself traveling between different teams and about saying, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, and you spend a lot of time coordinating releases. So if many, some, or all of those things are true, then there is a good chance that you may be an architectologist. And how does that end up playing out? In an organization with architectologists, you can normally end up with conversations like this, where someone says, I want to do something which sounds pretty simple. The architectologist will say, that's pretty easy. You need to use this system. It does exactly what you need. Talk to Sam, she'll help you out. And then you'll go and talk to Sam, and you'll be talking about a business outcome, I hope, because you're delivering business value. And you'll talk to Sam, and Sam is the person that you were told to talk to her. And Sam will say to you, well, I know exactly what my system does, but I've got no idea what value it adds to the end users. So her system will be siloed, it'll be locked away somewhere, and she doesn't really know what it does. She knows technically what it does, but she often won't know what it does in terms of the bigger picture and how it delivers value to our clients. This picture is a genuine slide that I once made for one of our clients, describing, it used to have lots of transitions where things were coming in bit by bit, and the little envelopes were representing an email exchange. The people were representing real people that I met. The little wheels are representing different systems that I knew about. And we were trying to do something really simple that we were told should only take a couple of hours. In the end, it involved 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different groups of people, at least 3 different systems, lots and lots of phone calls and email conversations. This thing that we thought would only take 2 or 3 hours ended up taking something like 3 weeks to do. And it involved all of these integrations of all of these systems. And at the end of it, we ended up going back to the the enterprise architect that we've been talking to and saying, you know what, why didn't we just rewrite this thing? We just want this tiny piece of functionality. It seems silly to have done all this, but of course it was the way they did it. So we had to use that stuff. So what problem does that anti-pattern try to solve, Architectology? Well, I think what it's trying to solve and get around is the fact that there are lots of legacy systems in an organization, and they're hard to change. They think they're business critical, and there's lots of knowledge silos. So these people are being the mediators between the different knowledge silos, I think. And nobody has ever thought of saying, well, actually, why don't you just consider not having the silos? And why don't you think about how you might modernize those legacy systems or not use them, or just understand the value that they deliver rather than starting from the premise that you have to use these systems. So I think the real solution to these problems, and these are very definitely problems that need solving, but a better way to approach it. Oh, I forgot about this slide. I'm sorry. These are the bad consequences from Architectology. This was one of the conditions. If you keep using all of these old systems and you work with them and you don't move to modernize them or bring them up to date or perhaps strangler them, fewer and fewer people are going to be available to maintain your business critical components because no one wants to work on an Oracle 5 database. Your releases will take longer and longer because, you know, to add new value, I'm just integrating with more and more systems. You're probably going to end up in a place where you're not confident about your changes. The silos will grow and start to defend themselves. People within those silos won't see the incentive to innovate. And worst of all, your business will find that it gets worse and worse at reacting to customer need. Your business agility goes down. And I think that a lot of large organizations that have these roles, which I would call architectologists, which they would probably call enterprise architects, will find that they're not actually solving any of their underlying problems. They're just working with them in a more and more expensive way. So what do I think is the real solution to the documented, proven solution to those problems? Well, effectively, it's tackle the core problems. You've got silos, you've got excessive legacy. So build cross-functional product-focused teams, fund products, not projects. So get people to think in terms of products, get people to think in terms of business value. Isolate your legacy. This is about software modernization. Understand that your legacy is holding you back. Think about how to decouple your systems and your teams from one another. Assign your architects. Yeah, this is a good one. I was involved in a thing a few years ago where the one piece of advice we gave to our client was change the focus of your architects from systems to business outcomes. Instead of having 10 architects that understand various bits of the system, reassign their role, get them to focus and own several business outcomes and talk about how to deliver those. Then they'll stop focusing on the existing systems and they'll start understanding how we might just add value rather than how we'll focus on prolonging the life of existing systems. Then you might go some way to starting to solve that architectology problem. Okay, so that was architecture anti-patterns. I hope I haven't ranted on too long. So I want to talk a bit about what good architecture looks like. And hopefully from this, you can pick up some tips and some ideas about how to take things forward. So I'm going to tell a story quickly. This picture, I'm assuming most of my audience today is from Portugal, so you have no idea what this picture is. This is in the UK, what we call a service station, a motorway service station. It's on the M1, which is a road that goes from Leeds down to London. And the reason why I'm showing you this picture is because I've stopped at this service station a few times on the way back from stag weekends, which is when, I don't know again if that exists in other cultures, but in the British culture, it means that one of your friends is getting married, you go away for a weekend and you basically get drunk for a weekend, then you drive back on a Sunday evening, which can be very depressing, and hopefully somebody else does the driving. But I've stopped in this service station several times after stag do, so I know that in that little bridge thing there above the motorway, there is a KFC and there's a Burger King. Now, that's fine, except I'm a vegetarian now. I wasn't when these photos were taken. But the thing is, in that place, they're next door to one another, the KFC and the Burger King. And it always annoys me that the Burger King has got this advert for their chicken products. because I look at the two and think, well, there's a KFC there. If I want to buy chicken products, I'm going to go to the KFC. I am not going to go to the Burger King. So I got out of my car this one time, and it was on a Friday evening. I'd been working all week in a place called Darlington in the north of England. I was driving back home on a Friday evening. It was taking ages. I was really, really hungry. And I was really looking forward to stopping at Leicester Forest Services to get a KFC, because at the time it was one of my favorite bits of food. So there's this is the Burger King. That's the advert. Now, if you look on the left there, you'll see that there's a notice. Oh no, hang on, before we move on to that. Here they are, the Burger King and the KFC. And if you notice on the right there, the KFC, it's looking a bit dark. Well, why is it looking dark? Because it was closed for some kind of refurbishment. So I was like, oh God, you can just about see we are, in fact, that's exactly what it says. We are closed for refurbishment. So I thought, oh, well, never mind. I'll have a Burger King beef burger instead. So I thought, that's fine. I'll get a Burger King. I quite like the beef burgers. I wouldn't eat them now. But as you can see, there's a notice pinned on the thing there, just to the left of underneath where it says collection point. So let's zoom in on that notice. You can't really see it. So I did write down what it says. It says, unfortunately, we're experiencing problems with the broiler. We can't serve any beef. Oh, God. But you can buy chicken or vegetarian products. So at the time, there's no way I was going to buy vegetarian products from Burger King. But it does say we apologize for any inconvenience. So I was forced to go to the Burger King and buy these chicken products that I've always thought, why on earth are they advertising it? So I bought this chicken product and thought this is going to be rubbish. And then I sat down to eat it, and it turned out to be the best thing I've ever eaten. And what's the moral of this story? Well, it is everything will change. You need to architect for evolvability. You need to be prepared to move with the changes. And for me, this is the first tip, the first mantra that I say we should take forward in our architecture now. Forget about what somebody said earlier on in the talk about architecture is the things that change very rarely. We should be anticipating the change. And that's the first thing we should do. So this goes into all of those anti-patterns that I mentioned. Why would you document something really thoroughly that's about to change? Why would you employ somebody whose role it is to always tell you about these software systems that have been there for 20 years? Why might you just not assume that things are going to evolve? And so on and so on. So here's my second architecture tip. And I think I touched upon this from the bit about architectology. Really, the first insight to the way that modern architecture should be done is to understand that the architecture of your business is going to be reflected in the architecture of the systems that you build. So if you haven't heard of Conways Law, which I think most people will have done by now, what you should be aware of is, so Conways Law says words to the effect of, and I don't know how it translates into Portuguese because I don't speak Portuguese, but the boundaries between the systems your organization builds will reflect the communication structure of the organization itself. And what that has traditionally meant in software design is that you end up with a tiered architecture where you have a database tier, a business layer tier, and a front end tier, and so on. Now, if you turn that on its head and say, well, let's just architect teams for outcomes around business outcomes, that is going to give you the best possible chance of coming up with an architecture that will solve business problems rather than solving or working with organizational problems. So to make Conway's Law work in your favor, you build cross-functional teams around business outcomes. And you need to be empowered to do that. If you have architects that aren't empowered to do that, then I think somebody needs to really examine more closely how your organization is structured. I think I've touched upon this on several occasions already. A good architect should be constantly saying, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Now, often you see this at every level of magnification. People might go to architects and say, oh, I need a database, and I need a transport layer, and I need this, and I need to build an API. And if the architect starts answering that question and saying, okay, this is how you build an API, this is how you build a database, this is how I want you to implement your caching layer, I don't think they're doing their job. What they ought to be doing is saying, okay, what is the problem to which this is the proposed solution? An architect needs to be problem-focused and solution-focused for real business problems. So if you constantly say to people, what is the problem to which this is the proposed solution? Okay, what are we doing? And if you can't answer that question, if you can't articulate what the problem is to which this is the proposed solution, and if you can't do it in terms of solving an external facing problem, an external facing business problem, then I think, you've got to ask yourself, are we doing the right thing? Or are we just following some process because we've got some risk management theatre in place? And I think a really important thing here about understanding the problem is, and I'm going to come back to this, is understand how to measure success when you're trying to solve a big problem. If you've got a big solution that is going to take a long time to solve a big problem, understand how you're going to measure and understand the success of the solution you put in place. And the final thing in this section is to create some architectural principles. I think rather than dictating architecture, a good architect and a great architecture team will give people principles by which to work. And unashamedly, I base this on the principles of Agile. So if you can come up with some architectural principles and ways of doing things for your teams, that should be enough. And then trust them to apply those principles to the best of their ability. So if you have architectural statements such as, we prefer libraries over frameworks, we should be concentrating on business outcomes, not on systems, we value the right tool for the job over standardization. If you can have several value statements like that, trust people to work within them, but have some mechanism to have a check and balance. Maybe you can have architecture meetings, but then you can start off by saying, well, are we following the principles? And if we're not following the principles, why are we not following the principles? But essentially what I'm saying is these type of mechanisms for working, this will start to build trust with your development teams, and it will start to answer most of those other questions about dictatorial architecture. For example, you might have heard of 12-factor applications. That might give you a good framework by which to start building your architectural principles. I'm not sure how many of those. Some of them look a bit dated now. But yeah, that type of idea, you could start with those and say what's good, what's bad. So what does great architecture look like? So if we assume, and bear in mind, these are my opinions, although I did road test this with a lot of my colleagues at ThoughtWorks and at Codurance. What does great architecture look like? Okay, so moving on, there's been a lot of literature written recently about metrics, about various things. Well, this has been going on for a while. So my first caution is be careful what you measure. This is a quote from Ellie Goldratt. You might have read The Goal. It's basically a seminal business book. Tell me how you measure me and I'll tell you how I'll behave. And really what that's saying is if you start to measure things, you will change behavior. For example, if you measure code coverage, you won't get better tests necessarily, but you will get better code coverage. Because I'll write unit tests that will just do code coverage and won't have any assertions. I can get 100% code coverage like that, but it ain't going to show that my code's any better. So be careful how you measure things. So moving on from that is this notion that I would love to see more and more teams embracing. I've started to work with several people on how to do this and some of our clients at the moment. There's a great book called Building Evolutionary Architecture by Pat Quara and Rebecca Parsons. It's 2 or 3 years old now. And it talks a lot about building architectural fitness functions. What this means is have a way of understanding that any change that you make to your architecture improves your architecture. So find a way to measure how scalable things are. Find a way to measure how tightly coupled things are. Find a way to measure how easy it is to make changes. Understand what things are important about your system architecture and find a way to measure them. It shouldn't be a judgmental thing. It shouldn't be something that you're using to measure the effectiveness of teams. It should be something to measure trends over time. So that if I say something like, for example, well, I think we should be using this component because it's more scalable than this other thing that we could have used. In times gone by, that would have been the extent of our design on that. We would have said something like, well, I'm going to use Oracle because it's more scalable than SQL Server. But we would have no way probably of understanding how to measure that over time. And we much less would we have a way of assessing the overall scalability of our system. So the point of architectural system fitness functions is to find a way of verifying that architectural changes have made things better. So what these numbers are, you don't necessarily have a view of what the target number should be. But if my number is X today, then I know that X plus 1 is better and X minus 1 is worse, or whatever. So these fitness functions should show us over time whether our system is evolving in a good way or a bad way. So how do we write fitness functions? How do we define fitness functions? Well, sadly, I can't give a straightforward answer to that. Although since I made this slide originally, which was maybe a year or so ago, there have been a lot of movements in this way, and I've picked up some techniques which I can share. Well, firstly, defining fitness functions. What we're trying to do is find things that measure the whole system. In fact, unit tests and automated tests, they're fitness functions, but they just tend to test one application or one part of an application. And my advice is be creative. One way that I, in the past, have helped to get a sense of coupling is by using our meeting system, like Outlook or whatever, to basically just count the hours that tech leads spend in meetings. And that gave us an indication of how tightly coupled the teams are to one another. It wasn't a hard and fast metric, but you could see definite trends. So if you started to decouple things, there'd be fewer meetings. And you can start to look at your tools such as Jenkins and Jira to start getting useful metrics on things that can matter to your system. If you see lots of rework on code, if you see lots of code being rolled back, if you see commits being rolled back, then you know that there's a problem. So you can start measuring those things and measure those in terms of maintainability and so on. Very recently, I saw a tool demonstrator called CodeScene. There's its thing. A quick disclaimer, we were talking to them as they're in use in one of our clients. Adam Thornhill wrote a book called Your Code as a Crime Scene, and he's got this great tool, his company called CodeScene, that actually will analyze your code and how it evolves over time. So it isn't a static analysis tool, it's a dynamic analysis tool. And that's really, really useful to give you some indication of the health of your system over time. Now, this is the biggest message that I hope you'll take away. There's a book called Accelerate by Jez Humble and Gene Kim and Nicole Forsgen. Gene Kim wrote the DevOps Handbook. Now, in this book, it's research on the state of DevOps reports, which I think have been going for about 8 years now. And what those state of DevOps reports show us is that those 4 key metrics, lead time, deployment frequency, mean time to restore, and change fail percentage, they're not just linked to high-performing companies and high-performing teams within companies. They are actually a leading indicator of high performance. And not only that, so there's those 4 key metrics cannot be gamed. They need to be looked at holistically, and you should constantly try and improve those, because you might see that there is a tension between say change fail percentage and lead time. Because if I try and narrow my lead time down, does that mean I have to test less? Well, not if you start to assess change fail percentage at the same time as lead time. You'll find that what you're doing is that you're reducing your increments, you're reducing it so that you're probably doing much more quality engineering to make sure that both of those metrics improve. So my message on these is find ways to measure those 4 key metrics. There's a growing amount of literature online that will give you ideas of how to measure them. You can use your Jenkins pipelines and your things like your Jira and so on to measure it, and iterate on those, and you will find that everything else should improve. You will find that these are the best way to measure the health of your system over time. The last thing I did for ThoughtWorks, and I've been building this into a proper methodology at Codurance, is answer the question, how do I iterate on those 4 key metrics? Now, helpfully, the book, Accelerate, gives us the beginnings of a framework to do this. It mentions 24 key capabilities in 5 categories, which I've listed there. And what we started to do at ThoughtWorks and what we're now doing at Codurance is to sit down with all of the teams, sit down with the organization at every level of relevant magnification, go through the 24 key capabilities, and work out what we think is the biggest bottleneck, the biggest problem that we have in each given level of magnification, and then come up with a plan, simple actions that will improve our capability in that area. Meanwhile, all the while, what we'll be doing is measure the 4 key metrics. And what the book tells us and what my own research indicates in the work that we've done is that when you improve these 24 key capabilities, you will necessarily drive improvements in the 4 key metrics, which will improve the health of your systems and will therefore improve the overall performance of your whole organization. So that simple way of iterating, and I've blogged about this, will help to improve constantly your organization, and it will help to constantly evolve your architecture in ways that will improve everything. So my conclusion is beware of architecture anti-patterns, Always ask why you're doing something. Choose enablement over control, always. Always say to people, I'm going to empower you to do stuff. I'm not going to tell you how to do it. I'm going to empower you to drive towards outcomes. Always prefer outcomes over systems, prefer outcomes over process. Define your fitness functions instead of relying on gut feelings and vague cross-functional requirements. Measure the 4 key metrics. Iterate on the 24 key capabilities. And if you do all that, I think you'll find that those are the building blocks to having great architecture. Thank you very much for listening. I think we take questions now, do we?
Thank you very much, James. Thank you for this recent presentation. We will having some questions.
Yeah.
We'll have one from Rodrigo. Well, I think we just have one. Rodrigo Carvalho, who is asking, in your opinion, software design is or not part of software architecture responsibility?
Okay. Software design, is it part of the software? Well, I think design and architecture are the same thing. What I think design is useful, but I think people can over design. I think my main message is that I don't think architects and architecture are a separate function from software development teams. My ideal scenario would be to have architecture owned by as small a unit as possible. So I think the answer is design. I think design and architecture are the same thing, but I think it should be devolved and pushed down to the teams. I think there is a case for there being overall system architectures that we need to adhere to. But as I said, I think if that is in terms of principles that are pushed down to the teams rather than prescriptive tools and frameworks for them to use, then it should all get to a better place. Now, I think, yeah, I have a lot of arguments about this. I don't think my views are necessarily the world view. And I have heard a lot of people argue that higher level architecture is important. But valuable architecture I've seen is in facilitations of conversations and collaboration rather than somebody that actually would go and say, we're going to use this way of doing communication or that way. I hope that answers the question. But I think essentially my answer, again, sorry, one more thing on that would be the best thing everybody can do is to understand the 4 key metrics at every level of magnification in their organization. Start to measure them and start to care about those metrics. Don't care about any other metrics. Then any good change to architecture will improve those metrics. Any bad change to architecture will not improve them. So then that should start to answer most questions, I hope.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you for your presentation and also for answering the questions. We don't have any more questions, so thank you very much for being with us, and hope to see you next year in Generation 2021.
It'd be lovely if we can actually travel to Portugal.
Yeah.
I don't like doing presentations from my kitchen.
So guys, enjoy the break and see you in 10 minutes. See you all in 10 minutes. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.